Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Aiden Sahba. I'm a first year studying government at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate, Matteo Cagliero.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Matteo Cagliero. I'm a current sophomore at the college studying computer science, and I am a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Student Committee. Today's world is one where knowledge has taken the likes of something that we all must strive to obtain in order to become the best possible version of ourselves. We should all know what to study, who to vote for, or more generally, what to think. True growth and true potential, however, are rooted in the simple idea of knowing what you don't know. Tonight, we have the privilege of diving into a conversation that challenges us to question our assumptions and maybe even embrace the joy of being wrong. Our guests this evening remind us that true growth comes from re-examining our beliefs and understanding the true forces behind skills like motivation. Open-mindedness is one of the most important traits we can have. But the real question is, what does knowing what we don't know even mean, and how can we obtain it? To offer a thought-provoking answer to this question, it is my honor to introduce your speakers for the evening. Adam Grant is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Think Again and Hidden Potential. He's the host of the popular Rethinking podcast and is the Saul P. Steinberg Professor of Management at the Wharton School. As a psychologist, Adam has shaped the way we approach leadership, work, and personal growth. We are also honored to be joined by Hannah Riley-Bowles, who will be guiding tonight's discussion. She is the co-director of the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School and is the Roy E. Larsen Senior Lecturer in Public Policy and Management at the Kennedy School. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guests for the night, Adam Grant and Hannah Riley-Bowles.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you again, Adam, for being here.
Don't thank me yet. We haven't even started.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled. We're all ready. I love that introduction. And let me, I'm going to throw out my first question. It was so good, and build on that. And I love this idea of seeking the wisdom of a wisdom in humility, in recognizing what you do not know. And here at the Kennedy School, we spend a lot of time developing our capacity to rigorously understand the world. How can we use that scientific thinking, that scientific method, to develop that humility, to be curious, and open to the idea that maybe some of the most important things is figuring out what we really don't understand?
I don't know.
Give me a hand. I got 2 books here.
That's all I got. Thanks,
Think Again. I'll start reading from this if I put you on the spot.
No, I think the place that I like to start is my colleague Phil Tetlock put a framework on the map for me that has changed the way that I think about humility. And what Phil described was the traps that we fall into when we try to make judgments and decisions. And drawing on that work, I've been so struck that so many leaders spend too much of their time thinking like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. And it's so interesting to me that this is true of leaders who have never worked in any of these professions. They've never had any of that training, and it's probably true of some of you too. So think about what it means to think like a preacher, prosecutor, or politician. In preacher mode, you are basically proselytizing your own views. In prosecutor mode, you're attacking someone else's views. And in politician mode, you don't even bother to listen to people unless they already agree with your views. I'd love to ask you all to think about what your biggest vice is of those 3. I'll tell you, Hannah, you probably know this because we've known each other for a while. My biggest vice is prosecutor mode. Once a student called me a logic bully. And my wife had to explain it wasn't a compliment. No, honestly, I was confused. I was like, what do you mean people don't want to be hammered with facts and data points until they admit how stupid their beliefs were? So where are the fellow prosecutors in the room who occasionally do that more than they intend? Raise your hands so we know who you are. Okay, and then can we get the preachers who love to drink Kool-Aid and then serve it to every person you meet? Okay, and then politicians. Don't raise your hands, your peers already know who you are. But Hannah, I think to your question, what scares me is whether you are preaching or prosecuting or politicking, you've already concluded you're right and other people are wrong. And that means you have closed the door to learning. You no longer have an open mind. My favorite alternative is really to think more like a scientist. And when I say think like a scientist, I don't mean by a microscope or a telescope. I mean, don't let your ideas become your identity. We all know good scientists have the humility to know what they don't know. They have the curiosity to keep seeking new knowledge. And they're as motivated to look for reasons why they might be wrong as they are to search for reasons why they must be right. And there's a growing body of evidence that if we teach leaders to think like scientists, they actually make better decisions because they realize, well, my vision and strategy, those are just hypotheses. And I've got to test them and find out if they're true or false. And my decisions, once I commit to them, those are experiments. And if they don't work, I've got to rethink them. And it's amazing how rare this is among leaders, and I'd love to see more of it, and I'm hoping you're going to help me figure out how we can make that happen.
Oh, good. But let me ask you, that's hard, though. That's very hard. How do you think leaders can bring people along if they're out, how do you both have that humility and be compelling politically or ideologically or around, even if you're brought in as the expert,
Well, I think we've seen some good examples of it throughout history. I think FDR did it, right? He was just excoriated when he announced his try something presidency, right? He said, we're going to try something, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And all of the newspaper writers of the day said, this is not a vision. This guy has no idea what he's doing. And yet, he was very clear about what he didn't know. And he was very focused on running experiments to try to, not to be right, but to get it right. And lo and behold, the New Deal came out of that. And it seemed, there's a lot of debate among economists. I'm not an economist. But my understanding is that that style of decision making was one of the factors that helped to essentially drive America out of the recession. More recently, I was working with the NBA leadership team before COVID. And I got a chance to see Adam Silver, the commissioner, up close. And I will never forget when the pandemic started. The NBA was the first major sport to close down. And it was unthinkable, the idea that just live sports wouldn't happen. And Adam said to his team, he said, I don't know what it's going to take to get us playing again, but I'm confident we have a fantastic group that will figure it out together. And that was to me just a stellar example of confident humility, right? He's secure enough in his strengths to admit his weaknesses. And lo and behold, that team then runs a bunch of experiments. They figure out how to launch a bubble, and they managed to play an entire NBA miniseason without a single COVID infection in the acute phase of the pandemic. And I think that's the kind of communication we want to see from leaders. I think it's rare, but I think it's doable.
I just want to pick up on a thread of that example, in that he wasn't just expressing confidence in himself, he's expressing confidence in the whole team, which seems to me potentially meaningful if you're going to enlist people in this experimentation. Can you draw a bit of a distinction between just try something and experimenting? So what would be the criteria for an experiment as opposed to just taking lots of action?
So I think for me, the big difference is an experiment starts with, we've got some metrics or at least some goals on which we're evaluating whether we've made progress or not. And then based on the feedback we get from the first trial, we're making adjustments and iterating and then testing a revision. Try something is we're going to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall at the same time and see what sticks. And I think the danger of that is sometimes you get good results based on bad ideas or bad processes. And sometimes the reverse happens. You get a bad outcome, but actually it was a good process. It just maybe wasn't implemented at the right time or in the right way. And so one of the things I'm constantly pushing leaders to do is to not just measure outcomes. Because I don't want you to repeat a good outcome that was based on a bad process. That's called luck. And the next time it's probably not going to work. What I do want you to do is, if you had a good process that didn't get you the result you wanted, I want to see you repeat that over and over again, because those are intelligent experiments to run. They're smart risks to take. So how do you know what a good process looks like? I think about it really simply on 2 dimensions. One is the breadth of options we consider. Do you remember there was a classic Paul Nutt study of leaders making decisions, trying to figure out what were the leading indicators of bad choices? Does this one ring a bell?
No.
Okay, so hundreds of organizational decisions, literally half of them fail. Not just fall short of their goals, disastrous. And the question is, could you have anticipated that in advance? And it turns out the clearest leading indicator that you were about to make a bad decision was you only considered 2 options. Now, we don't know if that's causal. Is it the case that adding option 3 would all of a sudden dramatically improve your decision making? Or is it the case that if you're a good decision maker, you tend to consider a broader range of options in the first place? Probably some of both is my hunch. But I think that's one metric we can think about, is how many options are we considering? Like, let's make sure that we're not stuck in tunnel vision here. And then the other question is, how rigorous and thorough is our evaluation? Let's look at the depth of analysis and make sure that we're holding our ideas and our tests to high standards.
And then how does a leader instill that in the organization? Because the leader themselves can't necessarily be the one leading all of the experimentation. I mean, ideally, you develop a capacity within the larger organization to do that. Do you have any examples of where you've seen that happen?
Yeah, I think one of the better examples that I've seen is at what has been called Google X, which is Google's moonshot factory. And they launched the early versions of self-driving cars. They did balloon-powered internet. But they've also had some really horrible ideas, like, let's turn seawater into fuel. Not something I would recommend personally, based on my total ignorance of making fuel. But it didn't work. And early on, they realized they needed to incentivize people to run experiments, but also to abandon the ones that didn't work. And this is hard. I think you've all probably lived at some point a trap that our colleague Barry Stahl has called escalation of commitment to a losing course of action, which is one of my favorite decision biases. It's when you make a bad decision, does not work out as you hoped, but instead of rethinking it, you double down and you invest more time, more money, more resources. And I think a lot of people hear that and they think sunk cost problem. But the biggest drivers of escalation are not economic, they're emotional. Ego and image threats. I don't want to feel like an idiot. I don't want to look like a bad decision maker. And so I have to then sort of keep investing in my bad call to try to turn things around. Well, the leaders at Google X realized this is a huge problem. And nobody wants to admit their own baby is ugly. Most of us don't even want to tell someone else that their baby is ugly, which is why there was a whole Seinfeld episode about calling a baby breathtaking. And leaving it ambiguous, like, did it take my breath away because it was gorgeous, or am I literally unable to breathe because it was so hideous? I don't know. Anyway, I don't know why we're talking about Seinfeld, but I think the Google X lesson was we need to incentivize people to run the trial and then pull the plug quickly if it doesn't work. How do we do that? What they started doing was they created an incentive and recognition program if you abandoned your own bad idea before someone else had to tell you to. They had a whole reward system built around it. You could get promoted for good judgment based on that. And they would actually hold entire parties and celebrate people who had walked away from their failing ideas. I think that is so important. I think giving people a chance to save face and saying, hey, this is not embarrassing. This is not going to be a threat to your image. This is actually something that we think is a sign of wisdom and good judgment. That, to me, is a starting point.
It reminds me also of Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. You know, this idea that people have to realize, or that organizations that realize that they can learn from failure actually can adopt technologies more quickly, can adapt to new procedures. But to your point, it's not just you're safe to make a mistake and admit at any time. There has to be accountability factor. And so, I mean, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that with some examples from your work. Yeah,
I think ideally what's happening is leaders are asking their teams to hold them accountable and creating that two-way street in a very serious way. So let's see, a few years ago, I got a call from the Gates Foundation. And the prompt was, we're having a hard time creating the psychological safety for people to tell Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett that they're spending their money wrong and their strategies are bad. I don't know why anyone would be afraid of that. But I immediately came to them and said, look, Amy Edmondson's been studying this topic for decades. She put psychological safety in the map. With that pioneering research, we can change this equation. And they said, well, what do we do? Because we've had leaders ask for feedback and tell people if you have any suggestions for improvement, please let us know. And it doesn't seem to be working. And so Konstantinos Koutifouras and I went and did some experiments and some survey studies with leaders and managers. And what we found was that seeking criticism is not always enough. Because when you ask someone to tell you what you can do better, they don't know whether you mean it. Are you gonna take my concerns seriously? Are you gonna be too busy to pay attention? Are you gonna get defensive and bite my head off? And a lot of people decide it's just safer to stay silent than take a risk and speak up. And so we thought, well, what else could we do to try to change that dynamic? And we said, instead of asking for criticism, what if leaders criticize themselves out loud? So we randomly assigned some leaders, instead of seeking criticism, to say, here are the things I'm bad at. Here's what I'm trying to get better at. Here's some of the constructive feedback that I've gotten. Here's my 360 from my senior leadership or from my board or my boss. And we randomly assigned leaders to ask that question, to share that information. What we saw is even a year later, after leaders had criticized themselves out loud, they were more likely to have psychological safety in their teams. Their teams were more willing to speak up and challenge the status quo, because those leaders were not just claiming they wanted to hear what was wrong. They were actually proving they could handle the truth. So I brought this back to the Gates Foundation, and I said, let's try to make this real here, and let's have some fun with it. Are you all familiar with Jimmy Kimmel's mean tweets? You've watched celebrities read the nastiest online comments about themselves out loud? Well, I said, what if senior leadership at the Gates Foundation does this? And to her credit, Melinda Gates volunteered to go first. She said, I would love to sit in the hot seat. Her team printed out on note cards that she didn't get to see in advance 20 years of negative feedback on her, and just handed them to her, and she had to start reading them out loud in front of an audience. I will never forget the first note card. It said, Melinda Gates is like Mary effing Poppins, practically perfect in every way. She burst out laughing. She said, I am so not perfect. And then she started listing all her imperfections. And I turned that into a randomized controlled experiment. Some people see the Melinda video really engaging with the criticism. Others hear her talk about the psychological safety she wants to build, but not model it. And then there's a third group that's a pure control group. 3 months later, only that first group is bringing more problems and solutions to senior leadership. Not just Melinda, but across the foundation. And I think it's such a powerful example for me. I think that sometimes when I work with leaders, Hannah, they push back a little bit and they say, well, but I don't want people around me to find out what I'm bad at. Well, guess what? They already know. The people who work with you closely, they already know what you're bad at. You can't hide it from them, so you might as well get credit for having the self-awareness to see it and the humility and integrity to admit it out loud.
As I'm thinking of your example, I'm imagining also that it can help direct also the staff as to where you want the feedback. So they're not just thinking, oh, do I have a better idea? But actually you're kind of directing them toward, okay, this is where I need to expend my attention because this is where, the leader has admitted a blind spot or wants, you're inviting not just global feedback, but like a specific action on people's part.
That is such a good point. It dovetails with something that we found in our qualitative study. So after we did the experiment with leaders where a year later, after they criticized themselves, their teams had higher psychological safety, we wanted to unpack why. And a lot of it was they normalized vulnerability. And they said, look, this is not only acceptable, it's actually encouraged to tell me what I can do better. And I expect you to do that. Your job is to help me grow. But also, to your point, they were more likely then to be signaling to their teams, here are the things that I need your help on. And then also, their teams were able to hear the things that they didn't know they were bad at. And so it became all the more important when you realize, wow, my leader has not mentioned that they've never shown up on time in a single meeting in their life. They don't know that is maybe a challenge for their team. Maybe someone should tell them that. And so I think it raises the bar a little bit on the urgency and the importance of giving the feedback that you might hesitate to give otherwise. I will say, I believe in eating your own dog food, to use a Microsoft term. And so we do this in the classroom. We take our most unpleasant student course evaluations, and we read them out loud. And I have found this to be surprisingly powerful. So the first time I did it, I had a student who wrote that I was so nervous that I was causing the whole room to physically shake in their seats. As a shy introvert, I was like, okay, I guess telekinesis. I can transfer my emotions across the room. Good to know. Then I had a student say that I reminded them of a Muppet because my movements were so awkward. They didn't even tell me which Muppet. And then I started teaching military leaders, and I'll never forget the first course review that I got said there was more knowledge in the audience than on the podium. And I was like, fact, yeah. And then another one had written, I gained nothing from this session, but I trust the instructor got useful insight. I'm glad you all find this funny, by the way. I was not amused. I wanted to quit my job. As a 26, 27-year-old teaching people twice my age. But I actually read these comments out loud every semester when I teach. And I find that afterward the floodgates open. And what I'm trying to do, and the reason the humor comes into it, is I want to make it clear I take my work very seriously. I don't take myself seriously. And I think as a leader, if you can laugh at yourself, it makes it so much easier for other people to be candid with you.
I'm going to take you outside the books for a moment, but this goes back also to the literature on voice. I mean, you're in a class situation. It's been my experience that, if students have the opportunity to give you feedback and you can really demonstrate that you're hearing it and trying to respond, that matters a lot to them. Yeah. And it's not just in the classroom. This also matters for work. Could you talk a bit about this idea of voice and why that is motivating, even though some leaders, again, might not want to hear it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really timely problem. I'm hearing from so many leaders, private and public sector, that they feel like they have a huge problem with employees speaking up about things that are not relevant to their vision or mission or strategy, and then getting really angry when their ideas aren't implemented. Like, well, that's a failure of leadership because you haven't communicated what your expectations are of voice. Of course, we want cultures where people can speak up because at the end of the day, otherwise, as a leader, you are basically you're choosing to live with blind spots, as opposed to saying, look, it's the people who are on the ground every day, solving problems, doing our work, that can see the things that are broken before I can. And yet, not all ideas are helpful, right? All views are welcome, in my opinion, but not all views are equally valid. And I think part of the responsibility of leaders is to be really clear about what helpful voice looks like and what might be less constructive. There was a paper years ago in the 90s by McFarlane and Sweeney where they found that people want to have a say even if they can't get their way. And I think what many leaders are failing to do right now is to say, listen, I want to hear all your ideas. These are my goals, by the way, and this is the kind of idea that will help me most. And then if I'm not going to implement your idea, I'm going to explain to you why. And say, you shouldn't expect that every idea you bring to the table is going to be executed. Here's why I didn't adopt this particular idea. And now that you understand my thought process and my values and objectives better, I hope the next idea is one that I can work with. And I think leaders are afraid to have that conversation. And so what's happening is many, many people feel like their ideas are falling on deaf ears and they were never considered in the first place. And that's a failure, I think in social psychology terms, that's a failure of procedural justice.
Yes.
That's a failure of leaders to say, here's the process by which we accept versus reject ideas. And here's the very fair and transparent way in which we decided this one was not one we wanted to implement.
There's a wonderful article in JPSP, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, by C et al. And it looks at procedural justice, and do you know this one? And uncertainty in decision making. And what they basically show is that for people who so decision making under uncertainty, I'm going to make a decision, I'm not 100%, like I don't know, I can't predict exactly how it's going to come out, but I'm making an informed, policy bet or something like that. For those people who can really understand what are the implications of that decision, a lot of them are focusing on how does this affect my interests.
Yep.
But for people who cannot actually understand what are the implications, they don't, for whatever reason, it's too complicated or they lack information, they cannot actually judge what the implications are. They're looking to procedural justice. They're looking to these indicators of whether I trust, but also whether I trust the leader, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important note, and it reminds me there is a little bit of a, I don't want to say a dark side, but there is a sharper edge of procedural justice. Kees van den Bosch, I think, first showed this, that sometimes the nice aspect of an unfair process is that you know who to blame.
Yeah.
Like if you lose your job and you know it was totally fair, it's on you. Like, you're like, wow, I am incompetent, I deserve to be fired. If the process was unfair, you can at least point the finger at your biased boss and say, wait a minute, I got screwed. And so I do think we have to be really careful when we work hard to create fair processes to make sure that people's self-esteem is not bruised along the way.
Yeah, I think that's... Now, can I pivot for a little bit towards specifically some public sector situations? And maybe I could even take a big... Early in your career, you actually did a bunch of studies looking at how do you motivate workers who were, for the most part, kind of working in the social sector, where it's hard to motivate these. The challenges are different from motivating workers in the social sector. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and then about what you found.
Sure. So I remember walking into a call center, and these were just fundraising callers trying to raise money for a university. And one of the callers had posted a sign on the wall. It said, "Doing a good job here is like wetting your pants in a dark suit. You get a warm feeling, but no one else notices." Didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I saw that, but it was very clear that these callers had no idea what the impact of their work was. When I was an undergrad here, one of my mentors, Richard Hackman, had made a career in part studying how to design motivating jobs. And the key factor in his model, for me anyway, was this idea of task significance, which is knowing that you do work that has a positive impact on other people. And here I was in this call center, knowing that the money raised was important, but also realizing that the callers were disconnected from that impact. And so I designed a very simple experiment that ended up being a series of about a dozen of them, where I said, let's just take 5 minutes to show the callers their impact. And a month later, the callers who were randomly assigned to see the difference they made had spiked in the first experiment 142% in weekly phone minutes per caller and 171% in weekly revenue per caller. So this is about doubling in weekly phone time per person and then nearly tripling in the amount of money they raised. What happened in that 5 minutes? They met one scholarship student who had benefited from their work. I will never forget, his name was Will. And Will walked in and said, this is at the University of Michigan, he said, "Michigan is in my blood." Literally, I was conceived after a Michigan football game, and I was like, no, this is going off the rails. But he said, "I've always wanted to go to this university. I can't afford the out-of-state tuition, and because of the work you do, I was able to come to school here, and I'm so grateful, and here's how I'm paying it forward." And that alone, right, that one scholarship student, these callers were able to connect their work to a living, breathing human being and see their impact. And what I take away from that is it's one thing to know in the abstract that your work matters. It's another to come face to face with the direct beneficiaries of your work. And we need to create jobs where people have that contact with their end users, whether it's clients or customers or patients. And so the question I'd like to ask people is, if your job didn't exist, who would be worse off? And whoever comes to mind, they might be individuals, they might be groups, you need to know their names, their faces, and their stories, and it's a leader's job to connect those dots. Dave Hoffman and I found in some subsequent research that if you were a transformational leader, sometimes instead of you delivering the vision or the mission yourself, it was more effective to outsource inspiration and bring in the beneficiary. Because the leader has an ulterior motive. They have a vested interest in getting you to work harder. And so you're like, are we really doing all that good? I don't know. Whereas when you see the person you've helped, you're like, okay, this is real, I buy it.
It's so important.
Did that answer your question?
It does answer my question. It does. That was where I wanted to go. I mean, I think it's so important that, I think also today, in today's world right now, we hopefully are doing some collective sense making about, what is the work these faceless bureaucrats are doing, and how in this moment of where people are kind of maybe feeling a little shaken with regard to public service, to keep in mind that really important service, who the beneficiaries are, who the goals are, the aspirations of the students here at the Kennedy School. You all truly inspire us. I mean, you hearing where you guys want to go out and make a difference in the world. But public leadership also, we have the benefit of this, to borrow a phrase from my colleague Matt Lee, impact first mission, right? We're kind of out, the students here are trying to solve public problems. But as we think about public leadership, I want to pull a little bit from a definition that we came up with collectively at the Center for Public Leadership. So public leadership is about this focus on important unresolved social and environmental challenges for current and future generations. But it is also fundamentally this opportunity to motivate and mobilize collaborative action across differences, right? So there's this beautiful thing where we are, and maybe this goes back to the preacher or the Paul, like there's this beautiful thing where we are drawn in by this vision of this difference that we want to make in the world. But really to make that difference, we're going to have to engage in some really difficult work, particularly in these times. And I know you've thought a lot about this question of like, how can leaders build their capacity, build kind of broader capacity to engage across differences? What are some of the tools and insights from your work?
Well, I think probably my favorite data that I've gathered on this, Tim Kundrow and I decided a good place to study this problem would be in sports rivalries. In particular, after spending 4 years in this great town, like Red Sox and Yankees fans cannot see any decency in each other, despite loving the same game. And I thought, okay, if we can get a little bit of traction there, maybe we can learn something that applies to other kinds of polarization. And I know it sounds silly, but you're gonna see a connection right away to some of the bigger political problems we're facing right now. So we ran a whole series of experiments, and we tried a lot of things that didn't work to get Red Sox and Yankees fans to even want to talk to each other. We tried perspective taking, and I will never forget one Red Sox fan saying, yeah, I see the Yankees' perspective, but they're complete morons. And the more I look through their view, the less I like them. And we went through a whole series of interventions that didn't work. And then it dawned on me that nobody had really thought systematically about counterfactual thinking in the context of in-group, out-group divides. So for those of you who aren't familiar with counterfactual thinking, it's the simple idea of imagining an alternative past that could have brought us to a different present or could lead us to a different future. And what's so funny about sports team identification is the sheer arbitrariness of it. Like, if you happen to be born in a different city, you would root for a completely different team, and your whole allegiance would be different. And so what we did was we ran these experiments where we asked Red Sox and Yankees fans to just imagine that their parents had happened to plant roots in a different city. Who would you root for? And then afterward, when we gave them a chance, for example, to spike fans of the opposing team with painfully hot sauce, they were less likely to do it. When we gave them a chance to punish fans of the opposing teams with impossibly difficult math problems that would sabotage their payment at the end of the study, they were less likely to do it after realizing, like, oh, I could have conceivably been a fan of the other team. And to quote the great philosopher Jerry Seinfeld, like they realized, like all they were doing was saying, boo, different clothes. Like, boo, different clothes, because it was the same player in a different uniform, and now they hated him after liking him. Anyway. So we thought this idea of counterfactual thinking was really powerful. And we said, what if we apply this to seriously divisive issues? We took people on opposite sides of the abortion debate and the gun debate. And we said, imagine that you were raised in a different environment. So if, for example, you were strongly in favor of gun safety, let's imagine you actually grew up in an area where people would go hunting for fun, and vice versa. And lo and behold, we found that not only were you less likely, we asked people to read policy and ideology statements by the other side and then tear them apart. Not only were you less likely to eviscerate the person who disagreed with you, you were more interested in dating them too. And so I think the lesson for me from this is we don't always need to walk in other people's shoes. Sometimes we're not willing to do that, but we can ask, could this have been me?
Yeah. I also like about that example, you're reminding me that some of the typical prescriptions are things like perspective taking, just to, like as you highlighted, which can become very thin. And if you don't actually have that curiosity, and you can turn into a stereotyping exercise.
Oh yeah, Nick Epley's research shows this, for example, right? Where he shows that more often your perspective mistaking. That the more you dislike or disagree with someone, the more you caricature their views to something much less likable than what they really are.
Yeah, right. And now another example is also devil's advocate. So when devil's advocate, we think of this as this really good, but if the person playing the devil's advocate role is doing that perspective mistaking, I love that, then you're not actually doing that critical thinking that you would ideally be doing from those types of exercises. So I love this idea of the counterfactual. Can you talk a little bit more about what do you think the mechanism there is? And I'm also wondering, like, I'm thinking about Kahneman's, post-mortem. I mean, what is that cognitively? Could you just talk through a little bit, like cognitively and emotionally? What is it doing for us if we're walking through a kind of alternative scenario?
So I think Tim and I are actually running some follow-up experiments right now to pin down the mechanism. And I think the clearest finding in our data so far is that what happens is when you imagine that your life could have unfolded differently and in different circumstances you could have held similar views, it's creating just a basic level of common humanity with the other person. There's a fundamental recognition of similarity as opposed to othering the person or essentializing their views as just intrinsic to who they are. And I think activating that realization that, in fact, they might seem like a different person if their circumstances had been different, makes it easier for you to feel like you are actually fundamentally like them.
So, and then the post-mortem is this idea of saying, like, okay, imagine, pause, we think we're at our best decision. We only looked at 2 options. Pause, we think we're at our it's very interesting to me, if you think about it, it's you imagine yourself in this situation where, oh no, I failed. So you can really actually empathize. That's not a caricature that you want to reject, and then have people kind of walk through those. I think this sounds like very important in this moment when we need to be able to think critically, yet the heat is so high trying to supposedly take on other perspectives that it gets in our way.
Yeah, I'm thinking about one of Danny's collaborators, Gary Klein, who said, what if we study an alternative to postmortems that you were just hinting at, which is, I'm sure many of you have run postmortems at some point. You make a bad decision, and then you sit down with the people who are involved in it, and you debrief. Like, what did we do wrong? What can we do? What can we learn? And Gary Klein said, why are we waiting until you fail to have that conversation? What if you could have it in advance and prevent some of those mistakes? So Gary tested the pre-mortem, where you say, let's assume that the commitment we're about to make is a catastrophe in a few years. Or we all agree it's regrettable. What are the 3 most likely causes of that failure? When you have that conversation up front, you get better at seeing around corners. It becomes a little bit easier to build that culture of voice where people raise their concerns and their dissenting ideas. You have a little bit of psychological safety because you're supposed to anticipate what might go wrong. And then you're less likely to fail in the first place. And I think that, obviously, we're not going to do this for every decision we make, but I think for high stakes, irreversible decisions, big consequences, locked door behind us, not a revolving door, we have a responsibility, a duty to do a pre-mortem.
I love that. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to invite questions from the audience. So we have 4 mics, and I'll just call on people kind of sequentially at the mic. So please start stepping forward if you have any questions, and we'll look forward to getting you in the conversation.
And otherwise, we can cold call.
So I want to go, so one of the other, I've loved this conversation and thinking about what can we bring from behavioral science, decision sciences, these insights from your field experiments to our leadership journey. Can you talk just for a moment? You also speak in your book about the what do I want to be when I grow up, challenge. And could you just share a bit, because that's another thing that a lot of students are coming to the Kennedy School, having this pause in a very meaningful career and asking themselves, what is my next thing? And sometimes around this time of year, they're realizing my next thing looks a lot different than what I thought when I was entering. And so if you could just share a bit about that before we open up the floor.
Yeah, happy to. I hated the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, with a burning passion as a kid. I remember, first of all, you only have heard of 4 professions. And so it's like teacher, doctor, astronaut, or athlete. And you quickly discover, some of those options are not viable for you. Others are not exciting at all. Others are not a fit for your skills. And the other thing that I've always hated about what do you want to be when you grow up is it encourages you to claim an identity before you've actually experienced the work. So I want to be an astronaut. That's now who I am. And I feel like I'm a failure if I don't live up to that. I would much prefer that we ask kids, what do you like to do? And say, look, these are a bunch of behavioral choices. They don't have to define you. I study work for a living. I don't think work should define us. I think our job in the best case scenario is an extension of our values, and it's an opportunity to express our passions. But it shouldn't be something that dictates our sense of self. And so I don't like the idea of reifying work. Like, what do you want to be? Well, what I want my kids to say in response to that is, I want to be a good person. I want to be a good friend. I want to be a good parent. I want to be a good role model. And like, that's not even an acceptable answer in American society because work is so central. So I think we should throw that question out the window. Now, that's not helpful to anybody who's trying to make a career choice right now. So what would be helpful instead? I think that Herminia Ibarra did some work on this that has really shaped the way I think about career choice. She said, you should think about your career decisions like a scientist. And what that means in her work is you're going to try on a bunch of provisional selves or possible selves, and you're going to ask yourself, is this a decent fit for who I might want to become? Now, what's hard about that is, I think one of the reasons you landed a place like Harvard is you're really good at long-term planning and then being laser focused on working toward those goals. But you can't build a map toward the career that you want in a rapidly changing, highly uncertain world where, by the way, AI is replacing multiple jobs as we have this conversation. I think a map is unrealistic. I think if you ever try to walk into a mentor's office with a 10 or 20-year career plan, they should tear it up and kick you out and say, come back when you have embraced reality and recognize that it is impossible to see more than 1 or 2 steps ahead. So what do you need instead of a map? You need a compass. A compass is basically a tool that allows you to answer the question, is the choice I'm making directionally correct? How do you know it's directionally correct? I think the only way to do that is to make a list of the people you admire most professionally. And the longer the list, the better. 2 is not enough, 5 is not enough. I want to see 10 or 20 on there. And the question is, what do they have in common in terms of their core values and their impact in the world? And then you can ask yourself, as I think about the next 1 or 2 steps in my career, is it moving me closer to becoming a person like that or farther away? And I think that's probably the best we can do.
The beautiful thing here is we have so many of those mentors among our peers, so many of those role models even among our peers. I'm going to start over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Charlene. So, Adam, you are someone with a public platform and public voice with thought leadership, and especially in this environment of an incredibly divisive time where people have very strong opinions, and it's really uncomfortable for people to be in that messy middle because it feels more comfortable to feel like you belong to an idea, an opinion, a whatever. So with that context, how do you think about the process of putting out your voice, your art, your thought leadership, and how does this environment inform how you think about that responsibility?
Thanks, Charlie. And no one has ever described anything I do as art before.
Really?
Yes, quite the opposite, in fact.
Well, to me, you're an artist.
Fascinating. I'm gonna never ever say that to anyone. Given that I can't even walk into a museum without being like, "Wow, it's cool that you can make that, but I don't get it. Like, why? Why? Where are your data?"
In the eye of the beholder, as they say. So.
Fair enough. Thank you. I appreciate the sentiment for sure. I think about voice in divisive times through 3 lenses. The first one is, where can I make a unique impact? Where is there something important to say that's informed by rigorous evidence that is not being said? What's missing from the conversation? Knowing that a lot of people are waiting for something that doesn't represent the outrage on either extreme. And so that actually feels like both an important and low-risk place to land. I think the second thing that I try to think about is, what are the widespread misconceptions that people hold? What are the myths that they believe in? And if I'm not courageous in challenging those, what is the point of having university tenure? What is the point of having a platform if I can't speak about things that people might disagree with? And frankly, I think what I'm trying to do in a lot of my work is to say, it's okay to change your mind. If you do that based on principles as opposed to politics, that's actually a source of strength rather than a sign of weakness. And so the worst case scenario, I'm going to put an idea out there. I will be convinced that it's wrong, and then I can model one of my core principles by saying, I screwed this up. Here's something I rethought. Which people, of course, then weaponize and say, like, well, shouldn't you think again right now? I'm like, well, no, not just because you want me to. Here are my standards. Give me proof. Okay, third thing I think about a lot is I think about the fact that it's so much easier to see what's true with the benefit of hindsight. Think about how many backward conversations have been had in America alone. If you look back 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 or 200 years, like how many absurd ideas people were attached to. People are going to look back in 50 or 100 years and think we believed a lot of dumb things. And so I think if you're afraid of challenging some of those misconceptions now, you're missing out on the fact that in the long term, you're going to regret not speaking. And so, I don't know, my stance on this is pretty simple, which is a lot of people are really invested in being dutiful descendants, and they're trying to please their predecessors. I don't care. My favorite meme on that is traditions are peer pressure from dead people. I would much rather, instead of saying be a dutiful descendant, don't worry about making your parents proud. Focus on making your children proud. Be a good ancestor. And when I think about, like, will my kids be proud that I put this message out there, it makes me much more willing to say things that might be unpopular, but I think are important. I don't know if any of that's useful.
It's all useful, and I think your response was art, so thank you.
I like that.
You might want to rethink that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't know. It's resonating with me. Okay, so I'm going to go through. Please, I should have welcomed folks to introduce themselves if they like, and please share your question, and I'll go down getting questions.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a sophomore at the college. And what I wanted to ask is, I was really struck by your point about sort of introducing people to the, if you had grown up in a different scenario, what would have happened? Because I remember reading some data that Americans had become more and more open to marrying or dating someone of a different race over the years, and less open to dating someone of a different political background. So I was wondering if, sort of tying those two together, what thoughts you had, since it seems to me regretful that people won't sort of bridge that political divide, like how people could sort of make themselves more open-minded, or like as policy, we could encourage people to be more open-minded.
Thanks, James. I think, I read some research a couple years ago actually showing that people would rather have a conversation with a stranger who agrees with them on politics than a friend who doesn't. I'm like, what is your definition of friend? I have a lot of questions there, but I think it's a problem. I think it's a huge problem. I don't have any easy solutions to it, but there was a test by a group of social scientists in the last couple years. There was a big polarization challenge, basically to say, let's look at all the social science literature that tells us how to take people who are divided and bring them together. And let's run a horse race and figure out what is the most effective intervention, a short-term intervention that can move people's views of those that they object to. And eventually, there were a few hundred ideas considered. They were called to about 25 interventions. And all of them were tested, and the winning submission was not created by a psychologist, a sociologist, an anthropologist, a political scientist. It was created by Heineken. It was a beer commercial. Some of you might remember it. It was called Worlds Apart. And what happens in the commercial is you see two people come into a room, they're strangers, and they have to build some stools and a bar. They have all the wooden supplies. And they work together on building the stools and the bar. And then they ask each other a few questions about like where they came from, how they were raised. And then they get to watch a video of the other person expressing extremely divisive views. So, like if you are pro-choice, you get to hear the other person call your views baby killing, and vice versa. And then the question is, do you want to sit down and have a drink with this person? And you don't even have to go through the exercise. You don't have to build the bar and the stools. You don't have to have the conversation. Watching that 4-minute commercial depolarizes more effectively than any other intervention that's been tested. And I think what's clear from that research is what it did was it took a group of human beings who we normally flatten into two-dimensional space and demonize and say, like, you are defined by your worst or most hateful view, and it forced people to look at them in 3D and say, wow, like the person who had that really divisive view also had a really complicated life experience and had more nuanced perspectives on different issues. And so I think that's probably where we need to start, James, is we need to get better at helping people see each other in 3D. A lot of people complain that the internet is one of the reasons we can't. But Michael Peterson has some research that made me rethink my stance on that. So the premise coming in is often, like, okay, on the internet, people are so nasty because your identity isn't real and you can't see the other person's humanity. Well, guess what? Peterson shows, this is across 8 studies, he shows that if you are a troll online, you also tend to be a troll offline too. Like if you engage in nasty, disrespectful behavior on the internet, you also are more likely to do that with real people in person. And so it's not just the internet. What is different about the internet? What's different about the internet is that people get rewarded for that behavior online. You do the same thing in person and you get ostracized. But online, trolls know they can use aggression to get attention. It's a status move. I think we need to change those incentives. I think we're already seeing work on multiple social media platforms to shift from amplifying outrage to using bridging algorithms, where if you and I are in a fight, it will amplify the voices of people that you and I both follow, which means that they're more likely to be a bridge between our views. I think that's a small step in the right direction. I think we have a lot of work to do on this, and I definitely don't have any easy answers, but those are maybe a couple places I would start.
That idea. Over here. I'll go over. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elmira, and I'm a graduate student here at HKS. Leadership development is why I'm here. This is one of my biggest passions. And first I would like just to thank you for all the contributions and books that you wrote on this subject. And my question is, what do you think is the most common leadership trait that is praised and admired, but is actually very counterproductive?
Thank you, Amira. I would say narcissism. I think it goes without saying that there's a time and a place when confidence is vital in leadership. But so often we mistake confidence for competence. One of the most disturbing demonstrations of that is research on the Babel effect, where the more you talk in a group, the more likely you are to be chosen as the leader. Because people assume, well, that person's dominating the conversation, they must be qualified to be in charge. And it turns out the amount of airtime that you command has nothing to do with your skill as a leader. There was a really disappointing study in the Netherlands, I believe, looking at who becomes a leader in their elementary school classroom. And in 22 out of the 23 classrooms studied, the more narcissistic the kid, the more likely they were to rise. So the preference for narcissistic leaders starts early. What we see is that narcissists are more likely to vie for leadership roles. They're more likely to be chosen. Their confidence and superficial charm is mistaken as charisma. But then if you actually look at their impact on groups, narcissists have a few pretty destructive effects. One is that they tend to make it all about me. Instead of putting their mission above their ego, they tend to engage in a lot of self-serving behavior. 2, they tend to create cultures that are cutthroat, where people who need to be collaborating are actually pitted against each other. They also create cultures where people tend to cut corners and engage in more unethical behavior. This is Charles O'Reilly and Jenny Chapman's work. And maybe most importantly, that high confidence level is a double-edged sword. We know in studies from banks after the financial crisis, for example, in 2008, that if you had a narcissist at the helm, your bank actually recovered more slowly because your firm had invested in riskier policies. And so I think that we need to stop elevating people who think that they're the greatest thing on earth. And we need to start elevating people who are actually uncertain about whether they are the person who is destined to lead. Plato wrote that people who want to govern others should not be allowed to rule. And Douglas Adams also made the same point. And I think whenever the great Greek philosophers agree with the great modern British sci-fi writers, we're probably onto something.
Go over here.
Hi, Adam. My name is Alicio. I'm an engineering leader in the self-driving car industry. And you've given a lot of great tips today. It's been really wonderful to hear. I've got a lot of notes, but I'm trying to put some of this stuff into action. So I'm really curious, how would you look at your body of work and direct someone to say, this is the first step you should take, especially when you're trying to build trust and engagement with the team?
Well, I never feel like it's my place to know or say, right? I think my job is to think about creating like a tasting menu in a restaurant and say, here are a bunch of dishes you can sample. I don't know which one is going to be to your liking. You should try a bunch of them and kind of run the taste test or the experiment and see what works for you. So let me ask you a question back. You said building trust. What is your biggest trust building challenge?
Stepping into a role where you are new to a very established team, large team, and you are coming in and they're looking to you for leadership. What do you do?
Okay, so the first thing I would do is I would go to a few people whose trust you need to earn, and I would ask them for advice on how to earn other people's trust. I love the research Katie Lillianquist did for her dissertation on this, where she showed that advice seeking is perhaps the most underutilized strategy for influence. So if you go to people for their advice, 3 things tend to happen. Number 1, you've flattered them. They're like, wow, you're a genius. You knew to come to me. 2, they have to walk in your shoes and actually think about, well, what would I do if I were in that leadership position? And that usually gives them a little bit more appreciation for your perspective. And 3, they will give you ideas. And they will tend to then like if you implement those ideas because it came from them and they had a sense of ownership. And if you do that advice-seeking conversation, it increases the likelihood that instead of being adversaries, those people are your advocates. I think, though, the caveat from Katie's work is it only works if it's genuine. If you're going there thinking, I'm going to seek their advice to manipulate them, they usually see right through it. If you go to them because you genuinely want to learn from them, that becomes a really great way to begin building the relationship. And I think it is actually a sign of both confidence and humility to go to people who might be more experienced than you, who maybe you could feel threatened by, and say to them, I would really love to learn from you. And I think it's a great foot to start a relationship on. So try it at your own risk.
One question over here. I'm not seeing it.
Hi, Adam. My name is Sana, and I go to the Ed School here. Your book and James Clear's book have changed my life, so thank you for that. My question is concerning, the awareness where you have an awareness that something needs to change, and then there's a period of transition, and you know that something new has to be adapted. So that during that transitory period, what shifts in your mental model needs to occur so that you remain committed to the cause while remaining patient with yourself?
Huh. Thank you for that. I actually think that the idea of staying patient with yourself, I think sometimes can be paralyzing because it stops you from taking action. I'll give you a personal experience on this. When I came here as an undergrad, I was obsessed. My whole life was organized around springboard diving. I had fallen in love with this sport largely because I got cut from the basketball team and then the soccer team and was running out of options. But I stumbled into this sport where every single change I made was under my control. Like, I didn't have an opponent. I didn't have a teammate. It's just like me and a springboard. And it was incredibly frustrating to try to make changes because I would constantly overreact and then undercorrect. Because I'd worked so hard to make this progress and then I wouldn't want to undo it. And my coach, Eric Best, would say to me, Adam, you got to make it feel wrong. Make it feel wrong. That's the only way to get it right. And what he understood that I didn't was if I made it feel wrong, I would actually underreact emotionally and then I would overcorrect. And if I'd been over here and over here, I could find a middle ground. And so I think for me, that was less about being patient with myself and more about saying, I actually want to dive, no pun intended, headfirst into the change and make a bigger change than he's asking me to, so that then I've experienced the whole range of what's possible and I'm in a better position to find the sweet spot. The hardest part of that for me was standing frozen on the end of the board, just afraid to go. I was afraid of heights. I was also afraid of getting lost in midair. And I would never forget one day I was supposed to do a full twisting 2.5 off a 3-meter springboard where you do 2 forward somersaults, then a 360 turn, and then dive in. I was afraid I was going to crash land. I was going to land on my ear and break my eardrum. I was terrified. And I stood there shaking for what must have been 45 minutes. And Eric said to me, Adam, are you going to do this dive? And I was like, ever? Yes, one day I would love to do this dive. And he said, great, what are you waiting for? And that became such a crucible moment for me because I realized that so often I've hesitated to take a risk because I didn't feel ready yet. And I had the relationship between confidence and action backward. That you don't have to build confidence in order to take the leap. It's taking the leap that builds your confidence. And what I found is that the faster I am to take those leaps, the less patient I have to be with myself because I've now run a bunch of those experiments and I've learned what changes are good and which ones need to be adjusted further. So that's my initial reaction, and I reserve the right to rethink everything I just said. I'm going to give shorter responses, Hannah.
No. We're at the end of our hour, but I just love that you're leaving us with this question. This, what am I waiting for? It seems like such a valuable question to be asking ourselves in this moment. But maybe it's also one that we can remember in helping one another through this moment to ask each other. So thank you so much, Adam, for your wisdom.
Thank you.
And humor. And I think we head off. Oh, no, we probably